information on Galen data. Galen data provides an FDA-compliant cloud for medical device manufacturers. The Galen cloud provides a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that is compliant to FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards. We are ISO 13485 certified, and product on AWS is HITRUST certified as well. Founded by seasoned medical device professionals, our goal is to make medical device connectivity available to all at a fraction of cost while shaving months of development timeline. Galen data allows medical device companies to stay medical device companies and not become IT companies. Finally, some quick logistics as we are going through this. If you have any questions, type those in the Q&A section. They should be on the sidebar, either on your left or right, depending on the version you're using. We'll either ask those questions to Darcy at the end, or if appropriate, I'll bring up those during our conversation. There's also some handouts on that same control panel that gives you more information on Galen data and a white paper on cloud connectivity. A brief reminder that the copy of this webinar will be sent to you by email most likely tomorrow. That being said, I'd like to introduce our guest, Darcy. Welcome, Darcy. Let's start with a quick and brief introduction. I have a slide here on the bio, but if you want to tell me, hold on, there's a technical problem I'm trying to resolve. Here you go. Somehow it said the recording didn't start, which would be an issue. Let me double check. All right. Why don't you go and introduce yourself while I solve the recording problem?
For sure. So as mentioned, Darcy Bockert, founder and CEO with Prolucid. I will do a little bit of an overview on what we do to set some context, but I'm a software engineer by background. I don't get a chance to write much code anymore, but definitely very involved with the technical side of these projects. And with some of the latest changes happening at the FDA, cybersecurity has obviously become a very important one. So looking forward to sharing more information on this as part of the presentation. All right. Just want to make sure the slide's visible there.
Yes, it is.
Okay, excellent. All right, so just a brief background and more just for context to make sure everyone knows, kind of what our involvement is and the view that we have of cybersecurity. So I'm based in Mississauga, which is just outside of Toronto, Canada. We're also ISO 13485 certified for software design, development, and maintenance. And a lot of the work that we do is under IEC 62304 and helping bring devices to market in FDA and in Europe and in other regions. In terms of kind of the different things that we do embedded desktop, mobile, web, and cloud application development. Quite a lot of work around AI, ML, imaging, custom algorithm, and anywhere data is part of an application, definitely a strength. And then obviously the quality, regulatory, and cybersecurity support and compliance. Everything that we do ultimately has to get through regulatory approval, and it needs to be secure. And so these are big parts of what we help when we're working with different customers. Also, just kind of related to that, some types of applications we have worked on, a lot in imaging and diagnostics. Software as a medical device has become a lot bigger component of what we do in the last 5 to 8 years. ML and AI integration, embedded systems, cloud and connected, and then custom integration. So as you can imagine, a lot of these have interfaces where software is talking to other systems, and so the whole cybersecurity element of it is a really critical piece. So that being said, I want to dive really into the content that I was talking before. It's a lot to get through, and we're not going to be able to cover every aspect of it. But what we really wanted to focus on was just a bit of background. What are the regulations? What are the requirements? Where do you get started? And then what would you do kind of at that initial early stage of a project? What would you do as you get really into design and development and building it? And then what happens after it's on market? What are the post-market requirements? And again, more focused on kind of a development implementation side as opposed to a pure regulatory, which would go along with this. All right, so let's jump into it. I think for a lot of this is really just background information, so it may not be new, but I think it's important to start with what the FDA looks at as a cyber device. And really, if you've got software that is validated or installed if your device has internet connectivity, whether you use it or not, or if you've got characteristics that could be vulnerable. These are all the things that the FDA looks at and says, if any of these exist or any of these are true, then from their point of view, you are a cyber device. And what we see is it's probably greater than 95%, but if you look at these and you've got some type of software on your device, you can almost be guaranteed that they're going to say you are a cyber device, and so all this regulation will apply. So what does that mean? If go into kind of the requirements, and a lot of this has changed in particular over the last 2-3 years, a lot more definition and structure around what the FDA considers the requirements for it. And I do have links that we're going to share separately if you want to go into it in a bit more detail. But at a high level, they're saying what information it needs to be submitted as part of your overall regulatory submission, which we will cover as part of this presentation. They want to make sure that you've understood and applied best practices with cybersecurity, that you've got processes in place to address any risks around it, that you've got an overall risk management and validation plan, and that you've got a software bill of materials and software of unknown provenance are all properly tracked. So these are the high-level requirements that they're asking for. What we're going to try and do is look more at how we would do this on a day-to-day basis as part of a project. Also, many of you may have heard that the FDA has and now are enforcing a whole refuse to accept policy. And essentially what it means is if you do your submission and you haven't met the requirements on cybersecurity, they won't even look at it. They will just reject it. It's become so core to the overall process. I think at one point they would come back and say, can you share this additional information? Now it needs to be all part of that submission. And so really the onus is on getting in front of this, making sure you're prepared and ready to go. So that's as far as we're going to go in the overall kind of FDA regulations side of things. Now we're going to look more at, okay, what do we actually need to do? And the first step is really just a high-level understanding of the different phases of this that you need to do. So there's pre-market activities and there's post-market. On the pre-market activities side, we have security design and architecture. We have the whole secure development process, threat modeling that needs to be completed, and the SBOM creation and validation. That whole work package is done, as mentioned, before you get to market. Once you're in market, as part of that, you've obviously got the formal release. We have to do periodic monitoring on the SBOM side of things, ongoing security monitoring of the device itself. If we find any vulnerabilities, we have to address them, go through a full kind of iteration, and then deploy patches that deal with it, as well as tracking of any related metrics. So this is really, creating a plan. Everything else from here on, we will go through kind of step by step what each one of these are. Okay, so pre-market security design and architecture. So as with every project, it always starts with you need to have the requirements for what your application or device or system needs to do. That really hasn't changed. Nothing's unique there. The difference is that we're going to be looking at requirements around security as its own element of that. So part of that includes creating security views. We want to know any type of external interaction that happens. And really, it's kind of a data flow diagram. So if you have a device that talks to an app that then talks to a cloud, or you have a cloud that has different interfaces or interactions, as part of this requirements, we want to make sure we have an architecture that shows what all those different interactions look like, where data is flowing, because that's going to be a critical element of the next step, which is the threat modeling side. So still have your project requirements, just now you need to look at what the security requirements are with that and create an architecture diagram of how data flows in the application. With that, it's going to then be a lot easier to start working on the threat modeling side of things, which is identifying anywhere that there could be a potential cyber risk for the medical device itself. With that modeling in place, we can then implement appropriate risk controls. I think for many of you, standard risk mitigation for medical is a lot more familiar topic. The good thing is that this is kind of the same concept. It's just with regards to cybersecurity risks as opposed to electrical risks or other risks that may come with the device. You'll then go and update the security view, and this can be an iterative process that we go through. Also, as part of this, you'll need to define an overall cybersecurity management plan. We're not going to talk as much about that. That's something that we usually work with our customers or regulatory experts on creating, but that is an element of overall what's needed. All right, so now that we have that, we're assuming that we've got that initial requirements in place. We have an architecture that shows all the different interfaces. This threat modeling or cybersecurity risk assessment is a very important component, and we will do this at the beginning of a project, but we'll also do it or refresh it as we go through development. And one of the methodologies that's recommended by the FDA is called STRIDE. And what it stands for is spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privileges. These are all, think of them as kind of the categories of risks or issues to really think about when you're looking at these different interfaces. And I will share an example in a moment here of what this kind of can look like. Ultimately, you're looking at, and again, anywhere that data is moving between processes, anywhere data is stored, any user interactions, and what can happen as part of that. So I'm just going to switch over and share an example of what this can look like. All right. So I will kind of come back and forth to this, but this is an example that we've done for a web application. And taking that architecture, showing all the different components and how they communicate together, we then go through the STRIDE category. And as an example, say spoofing. This is the specific asset or component that we're looking at. Here's the potential threat of it. Here's the attack vector. And we've ultimately identified a potential harm. And we've created what is the probability that it could happen and the severity if it does happen to get this risk score. And obviously, if we've now identified that it's high risk, this is something that we're going to need to deal with and figure out how we can implement risk controls to mitigate it and get it down to an acceptable level. I won't bore with all the details, but as you can see, these documents, as you start going through all the different components, they can become quite comprehensive. And you really need subject matter experts that can look at it and understand from a cybersecurity point of view, what could go wrong with each one of these components.
One question here, if you don't mind. So I see obviously the threats being written down, the attack factors, and then relation to harm. Your risk rating, is there a specific way the FDA likes to use? Do you use standard CVV ratings, or do you use a more traditional FMEA kind of stuff, which is the probability and exploitability matrix?
A lot of this would be more the standard FMEA type approach because we don't necessarily have a number that we can go and find for what the exploitability or the severity is. So part of it is relying on subject matter expert to say, okay, how likely is it that this could happen? And if it does happen, what's the risk? Are we talking about, okay, it's going to be an annoyance, or can someone now get access to patient data? Can they, influence what's going to be done with that data? So there is an element of subject matter expert that's required. When we get into the CVE monitoring side of things, where we're looking at vulnerabilities, that we get better information around, what the potential risk level and probability is of that. And that's something we'll look at a little bit further in the presentation.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm just going to switch back now to the slides. And we will come back to this document, this risk assessment example again in the next slide or two. Okay, so along with STRIDE, there are some other tools or requirements that may be relevant or of interest. We've really focused more on kind of just the FDA for this, but on the EU GDPR side of things, Linden is another, it's completed on top of STRIDE, and that's a requirement specifically for patient information risk. It's a bit stricter, the requirements around patient data. And so this is another review point that would be included. And then if you've got AI or ML as part of the application, there's a tool called Plot for AI, or approach that helps look at some of the potential cybersecurity risks that could happen on that side. So for the most part, Stride covers everything, but there are other, you know, approaches or I guess classifications that may apply depending on the type of application you've got. So that being said, the Stride, that is really about how we're going to identify what the potential cybersecurity risks are and get to the point where we've now identified a risk score, or how, is this acceptable or is it not? As with any type of risk, you're gonna have to decide what level, makes sense, what level are you okay with, and which ones are going to have mitigations required. And cybersecurity is no different. So ultimately, the goal is to get those risks to as low of a level as possible. We can most often reduce the exploitability side of things. Oftentimes, if the exploit happens, there may be less that we can do to reduce the impact, but if we can protect from it being exploited in the first place, that's often what we try and focus on. So we're identifying what we want to do. We're going to list all the different mitigations, which will oftentimes turn into new requirements or potential new pieces of code to be written. And then we'll update our requirements, our design, and our test documentation. And we'll do this in an iterative way until we're happy that we've mitigated all the risks to an acceptable level. And so I'm going to go back to this document again and share a little bit further to the left on what we're talking about here. So we take this initial risk. We said currently it's overall 12, it's high risk. We've then listed a bunch of risk controls or mitigations that we can do. Those then turn into risk controls or requirements that are going to be implemented. And after that's done, we now have identified that there's no remaining vulnerabilities after these controls have been implemented. The exploitability went from a 3 down to a 1. The severity is still unchanged, because if it was exploited, it's there. But at a 4 now, this is considered low risk, and this is something that we believe has been adequately dealt with from a threat modeling and risk mitigation and controls point of view. There are some cases where maybe we can't get it quite down that low. Maybe we can only get it down to a medium risk, and that we'll have to evaluate, is there anything that can be done or not, and how far do we go? At some points, it's just not possible, but wherever we can, we want to get these risks as low as we can. All right. So that kind of summarizes the early stage where we're at that initial project planning, architecture, doing some initial design. But as we all know, software development is an iterative process. As we do development, sometimes there's things we haven't thought of, requirements can change. And so what does design and development actually look like, and what do we do during that cycle until we get to the point where we now have a release candidate that we believe is ready to go for approvals? So where this all starts, on the design and implementation side of things, so we mentioned we have identified these mitigations. They become new requirements. And so we're going to be implementing those as part of our regular ongoing development. Where possible, we want to make sure there is some type of unit test or automated test that's been created to validate or verify that these requirements have all been properly met. And as we get further into it, at some point, we're going to want to do a formal pen test or vulnerability test to make sure that nothing else is found. So this is an iterative process where requirements are added, we implement them, we test them, and then at a certain point, we'll do like a dry run on a pen test, see what we find, incorporate those, and then go through that overall risk review really in an iterative manner. Now, there are some cases where you can't actually write a unit test or a piece of code that that tests something out. And in this case, we have what's called a verification by analysis assessment example. Think about things like if you've got a web console and you have to go to the console and confirm that the proper encryption or authentication or implementation was done. And instead of being able to write a test, you're now going to take screenshots and put those in a document. This is the type of supplementary information that is required. And I'll share an example of some of the things that could go into this verification by analysis assessment. So I've got a document here that I won't bore with all the different screenshots, but this is kind of a template that we use where we said, here are all the different things where we want to make sure that we've captured screenshots that prove these things have been properly configured in a console or they've been properly implemented. In some cases, we can even take a screenshot of a code snippet that shows how it's been done. But it's all these different requirements, and this essentially is our test results or verification showing that the requirement has been met, and this is something that would be included as part of that overall submission that's shared with the FDA.
Well, one quick question around this. Pen testing, do you recommend multiple pen testing as you develop, or because pen testing, especially external pen testing, can be expensive? So do you recommend that, or do you have someone internally doing some sort of vulnerability scanning pen testing and then have a external pen testing done towards the end, or do you do multiple iterations of external pen testing as well?
So we typically, as a best practice, the formal the formal pen testing that happens at the end that we use for sign off, we like to have someone independent from the development team and oftentimes independent from us that does that formal one. That being said, we have having a strong understanding of how they actually execute pen testing. We can do dry runs informally within our own development cycles to make sure that we have confidence that by the time we get there, that we're going to be in a great position. So it's to pay someone to do it formally over and over again would be cost prohibitive. But at the same time, if you can understand what they're going to look for and do some dry runs and make sure that when you get to that point that there's a strong likelihood that they're going to find little to nothing, it's a great spot to be.
Cool. And then another question on implementation testing. What's your or how do you implement like secure coding practices? Do you have like a checklist or is there a set of resources that someone can go to and say, these are the common vulnerabilities that happen when you write software, and maybe it's by language, or maybe
So there's a little
something
bit,
such
yeah, there's a little
as.
bit more information on some of the upcoming slides about some of the
Oh,
common
okay, sorry.
vulnerabilities. But part of this is training. We do have a secure development SOP that we follow internally, that we train our team members on, and then try and include everyone in the entire process. So when we're reviewing the potential, we're coming up that stride review, have the entire team involved in that so they understand what we're looking for. And then there are, again, common vulnerabilities that we're aware of and look for, and that's part of what we'll cover in one of the upcoming slides.
Sure.
All right, so I'm sure one of everyone's favorite topic, SBOM generation. This is one of the bigger new requirements that came with some of the latest regulations over the last few updates, and it's quite comprehensive. And so we're going to go through what it is, what's required, approaches that we take, some of the tools that we use to try and make this a little bit less painful. So SBOM, as you know, it just stands for Software Bill of Materials. And the idea of it is that if you're able to track all the different software components of your application, the author, the supplier, the version, all these different details, it'll make it easier to stay on top of the ongoing security and vulnerability tracking. It is quite a bit of effort to do, but the goal is let's make sure that what we're building is secure because we've got sensitive and protective information. So a couple of different standards. So NTIA, and again, there are links that we'll share afterwards for a lot of these. They specify 7 required fields that the FDA is looking for. So the author name, supplier name, component name, version string, component hash, unique ID, and relationship. On top of the NTIA guideline, the FDA also wants to see license information, vulnerability information, and support status and end of date support. So it's every piece of software. And if you think about how this can start to drill down, especially when you're on cloud and mobile, there can be a lot of different layers to go through. These SBOM documents with all these different fields can start to get quite long. So just some notes and kind of best practices that can help with this. Where possible, a lot of this can be automated using CI/CD. And so as you do your development, if you can be building this as you go, make it kind of the definition of done for each development sprint, that if you are using a piece of software, open source, a tool, whatever it may be, that you're adding that to your ongoing SBOM generation. And if at all possible, automate it using tools that exist. But if it's not automated, there's scripts that can be written that will definitely help with that. So it's important to note, this has to represent the production system, and it does include the infrastructure. This is where we have a lot of extra layers of effort that are required, because if it was contained to just your custom application and code, it would be a much simpler task. Once it's generated, it does have to be signed to ensure it's authentic. And there's a couple of different formats that the FDA is looking for, CycloneDX or SPDX. We follow CycloneDX ourselves. We just find it's a newer standard. It seems to work well. It's got great tools that support it. But if you prefer to use the SPDX format, that works as well, and the FDA will accept it. So I'm not going to go, it's a large file, but I will share an example of what an example SBOM can look like. As mentioned, there's 3 different parts to it. There's the actual SBOM itself, and then the sign and the key that go with it. I'm only going to show an example of what an SBOM itself can look like. In this case, it's just a JSON file that's been generated. So again, if I was to go through this SBOM is almost 200,000 lines long. A lot of that is formatting because it's in the JSON format, but it's got all the tools that were included. It then gets into components. This could be custom code that you've written, and then dependencies, declarations, definitions. So this is the standardized format for this file. I'll share a bit on some of the tools that can be used to actually create it, but this is one of the things that will have to be shared as part of the submission, is this the SBOM itself.
There's a question that came up around SBOM. How deep does the dependency tree need to go for the FDA? Because you can have dependencies that have dependencies that has dependencies, and for a lot of the frameworks you use, an example here is React, but it could be anything. Especially operating systems and things like that, you could end up with thousands and thousands of these things very quickly. What is the FDA's expectation? Are they looking at first level dependencies, or looking at 2, 3, 4? How deep do you go?
So we have the code that we've written. We have our dependencies that are directly tied to that, and then their dependencies, their direct dependencies. So it's the 3 layers. That's how deep we're going on that side. You can go further. It's not required, but you do need those 3 layers.
3 layers. Right.
And it's, as you can see, almost 200,000 lines. Not that many dependencies because there's a lot of formatting in here, but that's what's expected. Okay, so given how much effort this is, I'm sure people are definitely interested in some of the tools and automations that exist. So we mentioned CycloneDX. They have a great CLI that we can use for merging and verifying and signing these documents. Depending on what language you're doing your development in, there are libraries that you may need to use to help with this SBOM generation. Some of the tools that we use, Sync, Sift, there are others. And again, we've got these listed, and we'll make sure and share kind of as a resource. Here's the tool, here's the link to it, and just a brief sentence on what it is. That being said, as much as these tools are great and they help with a lot, they still miss information. And it could be because sometimes the information was just not public, sometimes it doesn't work correctly. And so where we will create custom scripts that scrape the internet or capture this information or just manually review and populate. So we don't want to have to do it over and over again. So every time we add a component, we want to make sure we've got it all done once, but making sure that it's all complete. And the reason is that there are SBOM checkers that you can reference before you submit this to see how complete they are, and they will identify if things are missing. And the FDA is ultimately going to look at something similar. They want to see the completeness of this. And so I've linked, we'll share this as well. It's called app.interlink.io. It's a hosted app that checks for NTIA and FDA fields. There are other tools, some paid, some free, that you can use. What we just recommend is use tools as part of CI/CD and ongoing development to build it. If you have to write scripts that scrape the information, then do it. Make sure it's complete, but then verify it. If you do that, then and do it as you go, it's a lot easier than at the end of a project trying to go and figure this all out. That being said, we do get asked at the end of projects, or someone that didn't do it, we do get asked to come and help with this side of things. All right, so just kind of wrapping up this example. So we've talked about all the threat modeling and the cybersecurity risk assessment that happens up front. You don't always know what open source libraries or tools you're going to use. So as these get added, we have to go through kind of that same process again. We got to look at what the potential threats or vulnerabilities are assigned with it. We have to give them an initial risk score, mitigate them, implement risk controls, and then ultimately they would be included as part of that formal cybersecurity pen testing that happens with a full test report with the test results included. So this is where it can become more iterative, because sometimes there's a library that you didn't know of that's just a better fit. And so the first pass that you do is not going to be perfect. So we'll have to do this, continue to do this, and review this as we go. Any other questions on that?
Yeah, there's a lot of SBOM questions, so maybe we should take them right now. So one question that came up is, if you're using like a Linux or any other operating system for your medical device, do we need to generate the SBOM for that entire OS? Or are we only looking at one level? So how deep, again, I think similar ideas, like if device has an operating system, which will have thousands and thousands of components, how are we generating the SBOMs for that?
There, and then drivers and else. Yeah. So your components, the actual OS itself, and then any of the drivers that you're using would be the minimum that we would want to cover. We get asked this question when if you have an application that runs on Windows as an example, just normal verification and validation. It's not feasible to test or required to test every single function of Windows. But the libraries and the paths and the drivers that you do use, we would definitely want to make sure those are covered. So it's maybe not to see an example where we know, say we're using an application that's interfacing to a camera, that's got a Bluetooth interface, that's got a user interface. Definitely any drivers related to it and the parts of the code that we're really working on, we want to make sure those are documented. But there are elements that are not related or not used that we can exclude.
Cool. And then another question around that is infrastructure. Let's say you have a cloud app. How do you document the infrastructures? In many cases where the infrastructure is not always in your control and you may not have all the information.
A lot of these cloud providers actually have tools that can help. So AWS, for example, they have AWS Inspect that gives you a lot of the information that you would need as an input to that. If you're doing Docker containers that go in the cloud, then that's your configuration and the items that are all contained within that would be covered. So there are pretty good tools that exist for the main cloud providers to help with that in terms of what inputs would be required as part of the overall SBOM.
Cool. I mean, there are other questions, but I think we'll tackle them towards the end. But there was a lot of questions on our SBOMs.
Yep. Excellent. I'm guaranteed there'll be some questions here that we'll have to get back to you on, because this is a big topic and a lot to cover. But hopefully overall this gives a pretty good idea of how to go about looking at and creating the SBOM and making sure that it's complete and it's got all the right information included. So the next section here then, and we won't spend as much time on it, is just what's required after you have your device to market. So it's really defined as periodic. We have, some cases where we're looking at this on a constant basis. Sometimes it's a monthly basis. It could be quarterly. I don't know if going all the way to annual would be a good idea, but on a periodic basis, we want to be monitoring both the SBOM to see if there's any new anomalies that have been included, as well as CVEs that may exist. And when we do this, we're going to go through kind of that same analysis process that we did during the design phase. We're looking at the overall data flow and the view. We're looking at what could potentially go wrong. And then if there are software patches that we think we want to apply because one of our software components has a new update, that's something that we can figure out then based on the priority of it when we do that. If it's urgent, then we want to get on it really quickly. Otherwise, oftentimes it can go as part of the next scheduled maintenance or update. So we're looking at the SBOM themselves to see if anything has changed or anything we need to be concerned about. We also can take all of those items and put them into tools for helping with CVE monitoring and seeing what's out there and vulnerabilities that have been found that we may want to address. And then as part of that, as with other ongoing monitoring metrics, we want to look at the rate of detection and correction of issues found as part of this. So how many issues are we detecting as part of this ongoing review? And then how many of them have we corrected, and tracking that metric as required on the regulatory side. So there are a lot of different tools that, again, can help automate these tasks. You can imagine if we had to review this manually, it would be quite a lot of effort. So there's the OWASP dependency track that we can consume as SBOM and have it monitor all the associated CVEs. Some of the other tools that can be used, Trivy, Gripe, BetterScan, there's a whole list of them, and it's because it is a big problem that needs to be solved. And if you did it manually, it would be very, very hard to do. So what we'll do as part of a project is, even as we're doing development, get this set up so that we can be doing and automating a lot of this ongoing monitoring and flag if something is an issue. Then once it's flagged as an issue, we can go and do that whole review process. Look at the threat model, determine if we need to mitigate, if we need to implement any controls, apply them, test it, and then release it as needed. So there is effort associated with it. There are great tools that can help, but it's not trivial.
A lot of these tools, and I don't know all of them, but like OWASP is a good example, only really looks at CVEs for open source tools. Is there a one that you use regularly that looks across both open source but also closed source components that you may have purchased? Or if let's say there's a library out there that you purchase from a vendor, how do you manage the vendor delivered that are not open source, but vulnerabilities into a library you may have purchased, let's say a GUI toolkit that is not open source, but you did a vendor. Do you request the vendor to provide you with the associated CVEs? What kind of vendor relationship do you put in for vulnerability monitoring on third-party tool sets?
So unfortunately, in some cases, you just don't have that control or ability to get that information, and you have to look at it from a risk point of view. What is that third-party piece of software doing? What's the potential risks or vulnerabilities that could go with it? So ideally, if it's a supported piece of software, they will notify if there are vulnerabilities that they've identified within it. So we've got great tools on the open source side. Most of the cloud providers and the larger corporations do a great job of posting when there are vulnerabilities that are found on those sides. But if you have a really proprietary case where you don't have access, I think that's something that you might want to look at from just a design point of view. How do you manage that relationship and minimize the potential threat vector associated with it? But between these tools for open source, the large providers and companies, most of it is accessible and pretty highly automatable to track it as you go.
I've seen some companies, again, depends on the relationships, but if you can put a quality agreement in place, sometimes that could be part of your quality agreement, is to provide periodic vulnerability information and patches as needed for those particular software components.
Absolutely, and even for us, we kind of do that as well with our customers. We have ongoing support and maintenance where we're looking at the code that we've written as well to identify if there's anything that needs to be addressed or improved. So I think having agreements in place where it's not open source or tracked is a great point as well.
Yeah, I was going to go down there. There was a question around, static and dynamic analysis. Is that something you do as part of your process, either as a development process, but an ongoing kind of maintenance process as well?
We do to a certain level, and again, this will be on a project by project basis for what type of device or application it is, and how concerned we are, whether or not we get into those types of analysis. But we do them in some cases where it makes sense.
Cool.
So I know this is a lot to cover. We've trying to figure out how low level to get into it is always tricky, because the next layer down could easily turn into a day to a week long deep dive on all the different concepts. But we hopefully have kind of covered at a high level just what does the FDA require? What are they looking for? Why do they, what information and why? How to go about creating that plan to tackle it. Highly recommend to build security into the entire development process as opposed to just doing it at the end. But if you haven't, and it's something you do need to figure out, it's fine. It's just going to create probably another development cycle. There will be new requirements that come from it that have to be implemented, and we'll have to go through that. But it's better than trying to submit and not having what's needed and getting the refuse to accept. And we are starting to budget more time for these projects. Some of it can be done in parallel with development if you do it as you go, but there are extra tasks and documentation that's required. And so, we're looking at a schedule for how long it takes to get a cyber device to market. Definitely plan on there being some extra time that's required and effort. And then the last point, there are a lot of great tools. We are going to share these links as part of a resource page for some of them. We haven't covered them all. There's ones that we probably aren't even aware of that could be quite useful. But what we've shared, to do those core functions and automate a lot of it, I think we've got some great examples that can definitely help. And even for us, we still work, even though we do a lot of this, we still have experts that we work with in cases where there's questions that we can't answer. So there's a whole ecosystem out there, and you're not alone where you can talk to people that can help.
Hi. So let's move into, I guess, more of a Q&A aspect here. I'm just going to take your screen out from you. So while we talk Q&A, there is information, there's contact information for Darcy's company, Producid, and also us. So if you have questions after this webinar, definitely you can send this out. We will send out the information that Darcy was mentioning, and we will also share this recording, as I mentioned, to you all. It also is on our website and our YouTube channel. So if you want to go check those out. There is a lot of questions, so I'm going to dive in, coming in right now. So let's see. I guess you kind of answered this to somewhat, but since it came up, I'm going to ask again how SBOM can be integrated in the initial stages of development of a SAMD product.
Yes, I think we try to cover that one as much as possible, build it into the the overall CI/CD, where every time each sprint as you're doing development, you are updating and adding new software components that get included with the project. And as part of that, making sure you've got all the required fields, just make that all part of that ongoing development process that happens. And then some of the tools that we talked about for helping automate it. So that's really the way we look at it, is part of CI/CD. That's what we want it to be.
Cool. Next question is, how do you relate cybersecurity risks back to safety risks?
So I think that the common analogy would be, when you're looking at just risks in general, what's the probability that it's going to happen? And if it does, what's the severity or the impact? And then from that, you have a harm that can happen. That harm could be a mechanical, a physical harm. It could be a wrong diagnostic harm. It could be a loss of patient data harm. So it's it's really looking at the exact same way, just the terminology becomes more what's the exploitability of it, and then if it happens, what cyber part of the project or application gets compromised. So I think it's really look at that the exact same as a risk, and from a safety, from a risk level or safety level, it's as low as reasonably possible applies. So when you have risks that are a safety concern, you want to mitigate them down to that green, low risk area. So this is the exact same. It's trying to make sure your patient data, your system, all of it is safe and it's protected, just like you would a physical device.
Yeah. So a related question on that. So we have in 62304 safety risk classifications, class A, B, and C, depending on how safe your device is or your software is. Is there a equivalent cyber categorization, or do you use the same kind of classification definition to also use cyber? So you may be a class A software from a traditional safety risk perspective, but can you be a class B software because you have additional cybersecurity risks?
From everything that we've encountered, they're independent, and we understand, segregation of software. So you could have your class C maybe segregated to a real-time device where you have a lot more diligence on that one, and the user interface or the cloud app is maybe a lower safety class because you can't directly harm a patient because the appropriate controls are segregated. So that segregation that we see in device from the safety class really does not apply on the cybersecurity side. We're looking at it as just where are all the threat vectors anywhere in the application, and then what do we need to do to protect each of those?
Cool. Question around pen testing, and the question is, does the FDA require the pen tester to be, or like just, does the FDA require the pen test to be done by another software vendor other than the team that implemented the software solution?
No, there's no formal requirement around a certification for the company that does the pen test or that they be an independent company. Definitely best practice would be you should not be testing your own code. And so if you've got experts internally that understand how to do pen testing and they're not writing the code, that is completely acceptable. In our case, we oftentimes typically have someone external do the formal one, but we do all the informal because we understand what they're going to look for. It's just nice to have that separation in the end.
I will point out though, the FDA guidance, while it doesn't say you need independent of testing, it does require you to document what the technical expertise of the tester was and if they were independent or not. Now that I don't know what that means in terms of approval, but they do make you document, who did it and are they independent of the design team. I don't think it needs to be independent of the company, but a design team at least. You just have to document that aspect in your guidance, in your submissions.
Absolutely,
Uh,
great point on that one. Yeah, that's we haven't seen them reject for it not being a different company, but they do want that documented.
yeah. Um, Next question is, with respect to FDA approval to cybersecurity, how useful is the medical device and health IT joint security plan version 2 or JSP 2?
Not as specifically familiar with that. Uh, the other resources that we're reviewing are all the guidance documents, as well as the electronic submission portal, and the different requirements around that. So I'd definitely like to take a look at that and could share more comment, but right now I can't share
Right.
anything on that.
I can give you maybe some. I haven't deeply studied it, but essentially it's very similar to the guidance document since that it it basically recommends a secure by design principles throughout the product lifecycle. So instead of security something you add on, it should be built in, just like we do quality by design, safety by design, secure by design in terms of cybersecurity. So it's not much different than what we think or what you have covered, but it does have a framework that is so it can be a useful resource to look at and kind of understand the process there. The FDA does require, oh, they recommend what they call a secure product development framework, or SPDF, and this particular plan can fit into that, and so can be others. There's the NIST has its own cybersecurity framework, which is pretty detailed as well. The FDA does also link to that in its guidance document. So there's different methods to do it. Ultimately, what the FDA wants is a secure design, secure product at the end of the day. Let's see, the next set of questions. Is there a standard risk database for cybersecurity like there is for safety lists? Like there's a mod database for safety that FDA puts in. Is there a similar list for cybersecurity?
So there's categories to really look at. The Stride does help with really the high level categories of what cybersecurity risk can be. And then there are resources out there to help with that, to look at things to think about to guide when you're looking at what potential risks are. The FDA itself is not saying here's exactly the categories and everything that we're looking for. So Stride to guide the types of cybersecurity risks that you're looking for, and then other resources that say, okay, for a web API, here's what to look at. For a database, here's what to look at. There are resources that can help with identifying common risks that could happen depending on the type of interface or data flow item that you're looking at.
Cool. Other question, a lot of companies view their cloud journey as something that can be deferred until late in the development process. Consequently, the cybersecurity planning only happens late in the process. With the heightened cybersecurity rules and scrutiny, what kind of priority and timing would you recommend to start the planning process?
So I guess is this a scenario where maybe you already have a device on market and you're looking to add cloud, or because that is a common approach. I think cybersecurity, your device, if it's got software on it, it's got ability to access the internet, you're going to have to go through this overall process in that device anyways. I think when it gets to cloud, obviously there are more threat vectors, there is more work around that because you're dealing in the public domain. And so the overall effort around cybersecurity will be larger, but I think it still should almost always be business driven. What's the core business value of the product that you have? In some cases, having a cloud where you can provide patches to devices out in the field has a real benefit as opposed to having to do recalls. So cloud does add extra complexity in some cases, but it also could be part of the overall cybersecurity solution. So, figure out what's from a business is critical and what can be deferred, and really think holistically about all these things. And it's hard. I have to look at this really on a case by case basis to see what we think makes sense. But cloud will have extra effort, but it also can sometimes be part of the solution, especially in that post market monitoring phase of your product.
Yeah, I agree. Next question, this is more of a regulatory question, but let's see. If I comply with FDA guidances on cyber and also the EU GDPR, can I be okay everywhere? Everywhere, I'm assuming, means the rest of the world.
So I'll give you a non-sanctioned answer, I guess, to this one. If you meet the FDA requirements and the EU, they tend to be the strictest requirements that we see right now. The combination of what FDA is asking for, along with the patient and data privacy that the EU has. So in general, if you meet both of those, you're going to be good in almost every region. There may be nuances that you need to be aware of for what Asia or Australia or Canada or others may ask for, but in general, they are those combined are a pretty high bar to be at.
Yeah, and I agree at least from a data privacy aspect, GDPR is kind of the standard that most other privacy acts around the world tend to refer to or tend to kind of model their privacy acts as a subset of GDPR. And I agree with FDA. I think FDA guidance is very comprehensive. And I mean, you think of it, it's all the best practices there, so there's not a whole lot to do besides what they tell you to do. So I agree, it's the nuances, the documentation requirements may be different. So some other agency might require more information or less information, but from a practices perspective and a best practices perspective, I think we are pretty good. Good. Um, one comment that came from one of the listeners is that that particular JSP2, the Joint Security Plan, is actually mentioned in the guidance document as a resource. So that's good. Um, let's see, what are the next questions? Is there a set of training available on SBOMs, SBOM management, I guess?
We don't have a formal one that we went through. There's a lot of great resources that we look at. We're not, security is not a new thing for development and for projects that we've worked on. So this is something we've been doing for over a decade. The specific format that an SBOM needs to be generated in, there tends to be pretty good tools and resources around that. So I think security in general, there's infinite options, anywhere from school courses to online courses and whatnot. For the SBOM itself, I think just some of the tools and guides for how to create it, how to verify that that's what we would really start with and focus on, as opposed to specifically a course to look at.
Perfect. Yeah, and just to reiterate the point, security in medical devices is something we think in the last few years just because of FDA's focus. But security in kind of the software world existed for a long time, and there's a lot of resources outside of the medical device industry that essentially it doesn't really matter whether you're building for a human condition or you're building it to run your car or you're building it to go to space. You all have the same problems and you all solve the same solution. So there's a lot of information out there from maybe the fintech industry, maybe the automotive industry that has done a lot of these, much more earlier than the medical device industry, and there's a lot to learn from those kind of initiatives. Um, Let me check. I think those will be. Oh, one last question. Is there an equivalent of AWS Inspect for iOS and Android? Question. To know all the dependencies of Android and iOS.
Dependency, the development dependency log files, there's special tools to use.
Okay. So as part of the dependency log files, there are special tools to consume some of that. I think this is a question that's happy to take offline as well and look a bit more at how that can be done. But yeah, there are approaches for that.
I think that covers all our questions that we have received. So, as mentioned, thanks for joining, everyone. The information about the contact information for Darcy and us is there. We'll reach out again to share some of these resources, the links that Darcy mentioned. We'll also send out the recording. But thanks, Darcy. This was very great. A lot of useful information. I learned quite a few things. And then thanks again for everyone who joined, and you all have a great day ahead.
Thank you.